All right, as we continue our look at the early church, we're beginning to move into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And today we're going to be looking at some of the apologists. We're going to be looking also at some of the significant figures as the church becomes more and more popular. And eventually we will end up with the church being the religion of the Roman state. But in that 2nd century, we have folks like Irenaeus. Irenaeus is a person who spent most of his life opposing some of the false teachings of Gnosticism. As we said in our previous time together, Gnosticism was a very popular philosophy throughout the Roman Empire, and Irenaeus spent a lot of his time trying to say that those Gnostic teachings, many of which were being brought into the church by folks coming in as Christians, that those Gnostic teachings were wrong. He spent most of his life in Lyon, France, and above everything else, he was a pastor, and he saw how frustrated his parishioners were with those Gnostic teachings and how difficult it was for them to let those teachings go and to rely on the scriptures. Notice one of his famous quotes: "The glory of God is man fully alive, and the life of man is a vision of God." Tertullian was another outstanding apologist. He is significant in the Western Church because he is probably the premier apologist for the Western Church. He is the one who lays the foundation for sound Western theology. And growing up in North Africa, he is the first person to really mention the Trinity and begin teaching that classic Christian doctrine that we hold to be true today. Notice that this comes in the 2nd century. As you know, the word Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible. So Tertullian is the one who's taken the various teachings of Paul and the Gospels and is developing that theology about the Trinity. And it is Tertullian also who gives that classic quote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." This is a picture of some Egyptian Christians who were in, I believe, Libya. They were looking for work, and the folks in black obviously are ISIS, and perhaps you remember this story of them being brought along the beach and then killed on the beach. But it's Tertullian who said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." Tertullian also, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, said, if the Tiber rises too high or the Nile too low, the remedy is always feeding Christians to the lions. So Tertullian provided a lot of inspiration for the early Christians. He was followed by Clement of Alexandria, someone that we don't hear much about. But Clement was a person who was well schooled in the various philosophies that were popular during that time. And rather than seeing Platonism and Stoicism and the other philosophies as enemies of the church, he said that he believed that these philosophies could be used as open portals into Christianity. He said that he believed that Christianity preceded, at least in Judaism, preceded the Greek philosophies, so that what was happening was that it was really, instead of causing stumbling blocks for people, it's really preparing the way for the Christian message. Notice he is famous for saying, "Christ has turned all of our sunsets into dawn." Here's another person you haven't heard much of. His name is Origen. He is a prolific writer among the early apologist. He began his work at 18, and he was the one who really begins to take all of the Christian theology and put it together in a systematized way. He wrote over 6,000 scrolls, so you could tell that he was spending a lot of his time thinking and writing. And for many who are in the Greek-speaking world, he is a foundational apologist. If Tertullian was for the Latin-speaking world, Origen was for the Greek-speaking world. And notice what he is quoted as saying, "Daily we read the scriptures and experience dryness of soul until God grants food to satisfy the soul's hunger." So as we begin to look at early church worship, we will begin to see that it's not quite exactly like what we have today. The early church worship was one that was full of joy and excitement, because foundationally the message of the early church was Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead, and as a result of that resurrection, we can know that death has lost its sting and the grave has lost its victory. They also saw those early worship services as a foretaste of a coming heavenly banquet. So as they were gathering together with various ethnicities and cultures in these Christian churches, they were really getting a foretaste of what the completed kingdom of heaven was like. The early church worship really had two primary foci. You would have two services, as far as we know, held on the first day of the week. That was done in recognition of Jesus' resurrection from the dead on Sunday. The first service was very much like a modified Jewish synagogue service. It would have taken place early in the morning, probably 6 or 6:30. If the sun is up and everybody's at work at 7, then this would have been early in the morning. Sunday was not yet a holiday, so it was a work day. But at the conclusion of that work day, they would once again gather together and they would have a love feast, a little bit of a potluck, and then that would be followed by communion. Now, by the end of the 2nd century, that communion has been moved back into the early morning worship service. There were two sacraments in the 2nd century church. The first was the Lord's Supper. It was done every time they got together, at least on Sundays. And the second was baptism. They believed that these two were the practices that Jesus instituted himself and modeled for them, and these were the only two sacraments of the early church. Now, what's interesting is this connection between baptism and the Lord's Supper. As we'll see in just a moment, only baptized believers could take the Lord's Supper. So when you have that service in the evening, then that means that you can invite all your friends to the morning service, your non-believers. They can come and be part of the love feast. And then at the end, they're just politely excused while the believers take the communion. But here we see a lady being baptized. She's being immersed. And baptism by immersion was practiced widely, but you'll notice that it's not the only kind of immersion that is being practiced, because you could also have water poured over you if you were not immersed in a river or stream or a pond. But like we said earlier, baptism was important because whether it was the pouring or the immersion, it marked the end of your old life and the beginning of your new life in Jesus. And that enabled you to take communion. It usually took place on Easter Sunday morning. It's not like today where we would have someone come decide to be a follower of Jesus. This week they call the pastor, and within the next week to 3 weeks they're being baptized in church. Baptism in this day and age was very often a death warrant. It put you on the Roman radar screen as a potential traitor. to the empire. And so the early Christians did not want the new believers to come in not knowing what they might have to die for. So you end up with a 7-week period of preparation, and that is called Lent, and that is where we get our season of Lent. And those who had already been baptized would also use this 7-week time of preparation to prepare them to renew their own vows. Now you can see by this chart that during the first 3 centuries of the Christian church, it is much less than 10% of the population. But notice what happens somewhere in the 300s. It takes off astronomically or exponentially. We're going to look at some of the ways that it moves from being an isolated, persecuted church and moves into being the state church. Probably the person who's most responsible for this is Constantine. As we said in the last video lecture, Constantine issued that Edict of Milan, and in doing so, he's not making Christianity the state religion, but he's making it a tolerated religion. And so what he really was doing was killing about 4 birds with 1 stone. He saw in the midst of a culture that did not have any unifying principles, or particularly like emperor worship, and didn't have any stated enemies that were substantial. He saw a culture that was falling apart, and he saw that in the church he could have a religion and have a factor that could help unite the empire and save classical culture. So really, as he begins to move into the Christian faith himself, and as he begins to put his imperial weight in on religious matters, he's using them very practically as a new center of unity. He also, as we said earlier, makes that official as he issues the Edict of Milan in 313, and that, of course, ensures religious freedom of worship for all people. He's going to insert himself into religious questions. He's going to, like this cat, he's going to say, okay, if Christianity is going to be the state religion and not going to be persecuted, then I'm going to have some say in helping dispute some matters within the church. And that's one of the problems that comes with church and state being melded, is that the religion naturally would like to have state approval, but having state approval means you're probably going to have state interference. One of the issues that Constantine wanted resolved was the issue involving the Donatists. During those persecutions prior to Constantine, there had been bishops who had come under severe persecution, and they had recanted. They had not remained faithful. They had said Caesar is Lord, or something along those lines. Well, the persecution lightens up. The Decius and other emperors who were responsible for it die, and so the bishops come and they have friends who want them to continue in their role as a bishop, and then you have other people who are coming along and say, whoa, 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 these bishops, when they recanted, when they seemed to give way to the persecution, they lost all their legitimacy because so we don't think that they should be enabled to continue in their role. It was a very real controversy, and Constantine called a synod in Rome, and that synod kind of came to this conclusion. Yes, the true test of a man's character is who he is and what he does when no one is watching, but they say that the sacraments have validity in and of themselves, and they're not dependent on the officiant's character. Just because the bishop who ordained you had recanted or apostatized does not mean that that bishop's ordination of you as a priest or an elder is no longer valid. Constantine built Constantinople as the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. He felt like Rome was just full of all sorts of politics and intrigue, so he went about 1,000 miles away, and in the east he built a second capital. In fact, he moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. Notice he founds it in about 330. And as a result, it becomes the center of political power in the East. It is the capital of the Roman Empire. There's still plenty of people in Rome, but they no longer have the same political power that they had when the emperor was living there. And their major jurisdiction is the Latin-speaking West. And so Constantinople, pictured here, this is now a mosque, but this is the Hagia Sophia, the Mother Church, Holy Wisdom Church, the Mother Church of all of Eastern Christianity. So if you can picture this church without the minarets there or the golden scimitar on top of the dome, that is the most beautiful church and the biggest church in all of Eastern Christianity. You can see how the empire was divided here. All of the areas from the Visigoths, that cream-colored area, all of the empire to the left of that was all Latin-speaking Western Roman Empire, and all of the area to the east, to the right of that, is all Greek-speaking. And but Constantine's capital is right there, just above the Diocese of Asia and just below the Diocese of Thracia. You can see where Europe and Asia meet there. That's where Constantinople is located. His sons and the subsequent successors continued to develop this idea that the church was a good institution to have in empire building. So they continued to support the church. They continued to ban pagan policies and practices. But eventually an emperor arises, now known as Julian the Apostate, who decided that he didn't like what Christianity had done in his family. He said, I felt like I was forced to become a Christian. And so he decided that he was going to issue an edict throughout the Roman Empire that supported all of the old practices, all the old Roman gods, all of the old pagan sacrifices. And so his reign continued until eventually Theodosius I emerges, and it is Theodosius I who, and I know you've never heard his name before, but Theodosius I is going to make Christianity the exclusive religion of the state, and it is he who is going to end that process of Christianity moving from being a persecuted sect of Judaism to being the state religion of Rome. It will finally end up in Justinian, and Justinian will be the person who builds the Hagia Sophia. It's Justinian who not only builds that church, but also writes down and has the basic Roman laws written down into a body of laws that are applied throughout the Eastern Empire. And it is, unbeknownst to him, it will be this body of laws which will form the foundation for, in the subsequent centuries, for many of the laws that the European and Western countries have as foundations for their current law system.